There are moments in history when the line between hero and villain blurs, when the deeds of a man are both revered and reviled, celebrated in one part of the world and condemned in another. Today, we peel back the layers of a story that has been hidden in plain sight. A tale of ambition, greed, and a facade so cunning that it fooled the world for decades. We venture into the shadows of King Leopold II of Belgium, a man who some called a visionary leader, a hero of progress, but who others knew only as a monster in a crown. Leopold II came to power in 1865, a time when Belgium was a relatively small and young country, surrounded by larger, more powerful European nations. He was a king with a grand vision, one that went beyond the borders of his tiny nation. Leopold wanted to make Belgium great, not through the art of diplomacy or military conquests, but through the vast opportunities that lay hidden in the unexplored heart of Africa. Now, to understand Leopold's ambition, you have to understand the mindset of Europe at the time. The late 19th century was the age of imperialism, a frenzy where European powers were scrambling to carve up the African continent, driven by the thirst for land, resources, and economic dominance. They cloaked their greed in words like civilization and progress, claiming to bring enlightenment to the so-called dark continent. But make no mistake, my friends, beneath these noble pretenses lay the cold, calculated desires of men who would stop at nothing to enrich themselves. At the Berlin Conference, Europe's elite gathered to decide the fate of Africa, and without a single African present, it was here that Leopold made his move. With the cunning of a chess master, he positioned himself not as a conqueror, but as a humanitarian. He promised to end the Arab slave trade, to bring civilization and Christianity to the Congo. He spoke of building schools, roads, and hospitals, a vision so noble that he convinced the world to entrust him with a land mass 80 times the size of Belgium. And thus in 1885, the Congo Free State was born, not as a colony of Belgium, but as the personal property of King Leopold II. Just imagine that. A nation handed over to a single man, its fate tied to his ambitions. The Congo wasn't just a piece on the geopolitical board. It was Leopold's private empire, where he would rule with absolute power, and none of the scrutiny faced by other colonial powers. Back in Belgium, Leopold's star was rising. He was hailed as a visionary, a modernizer, someone who was transforming his country into a beacon of progress. The wealth from the Congo flowed into Europe, and with it, Leopold funded grand architectural projects, monuments, palaces, sprawling parks that still stand today. He was a king who, in the eyes of his people, had taken a small nation and placed it on the global stage. His statues adorned the squares, and his name was whispered with respect in Trusana. To the Belgians, he was a hero, someone who had elevated their country to heights they never dreamed of. Back in Belgium, Leopold's star was rising. He was hailed as a visionary, a modernizer, and someone who was transforming his country into a beacon of progress. The wealth from the Congo flowed into Europe, and with it, Leopold funded grand architectural projects, monuments, palaces, sprawling parks that still stand today. He was a king who, in the eyes of his people, had taken a small nation and placed it on the global stage. His statues adorned the squares, and his name was whispered with respect in the halls of power. To the Belgians, he was a hero, someone who had elevated their country to heights they never dreamed of. But as is often the case with history, the truth has a way of slipping through the cracks of carefully constructed lies. While the streets of Brussels were being paved with wealth, the reality on the ground in the Congo was a world apart, a reality shrouded in darkness and hidden from the prying eyes of the world. What the newspapers in Europe didn't show were the cries of a people shackled by the very man they were told had come to save them. You see, Leopold's Congo was no philanthropic endeavor. His vision wasn't one of enlightenment, but of exploitation. He didn't see the Congolese as people. He saw them as tools, hands that could be forced to harvest the land's rich bounty of rubber and ivory. And so, with a ruthlessness that shocked even his contemporaries, Leopold turned the Congo into his own private cash machine, fueled by the sweat and blood of its native inhabitants. He set up a system of forced labor that was as brutal as it was efficient. Entire villages were turned into work camps. Men, women, and even children were made to toil under the most inhumane conditions. Quotas were imposed on the collection of rubber, and failure to meet these impossible demands was punished not with reprimands, but with the lash, with mutilation, or with death itself. The enforcers of Leopold's reign of terror were the infamous Force Publique, a merciless army made up of African conscripts led by European officers. They were paid not in wages, but in severed hands. Yes, you heard that right. Severed hands became the currency of cruelty, a twisted proof that bullets weren't wasted on the innocent, but used only to enforce the will of their king. Entire villages were wiped out, and those who dared to resist faced brutal retaliation. To them, Leopold wasn't a king, he was a specter with a shadow that brought death and despair wherever his influence reached. The numbers entered their staggering. Millions of lives lost, families torn apart, cultures annihilated. The population of the Congo reduced by an estimated 10 million people in just a few decades. This wasn't just a tragedy, this was a catastrophe on a scale that shook the soul of humanity itself. And yet back in Europe, Leopold continued to smile for the cameras, his hands not stained with ink, but with the blood of a people he claimed to uplift. This is the dual legacy of King Leopold II, builder of a nation, destroyer of another. His story is not just a chapter in the history of Belgium or the Congo. No, it's a cautionary tale, a tale of how power and greed can twist a man's soul, and how the truth can be hidden behind the grandest of lies. For in the echoes of his deeds, we find not only the glimmers of his ambition, but also the shadows of his crimes. And now, my friends, I ask you, how do we measure a man's legacy? By the monuments he built or by the lives he destroyed? In the end, can we ever separate the hero from the monster? Or are they one and the same, bound by the echoes of the past? So here we are, standing on the precipice of a great tragedy, staring into the abyss of human cruelty and greed. We've seen how King Leopold II, with his honeyed words and grand illusions, wrapped the world in a web of deception. But as the truth of his dark empire in the Congo Free State began to seep into the consciousness of the world, a force emerged, one that Leopold hadn't counted on, a force that would shine a light into the deepest shadows of his reign. That force was the power of truth itself. It was in the early 1900s that a few brave souls began to uncover the truth of what was happening in Leopold's private kingdom. Among them was a man named E.D. Morel, a simple shipping clerk, who stumbled upon a discrepancy that just didn't make sense. He noticed that ships leaving Belgium for the Congo were filled with guns and ammunition, yet those returning carried only rubber and ivory. No goods that would suggest fair trade. No signs of a balanced exchange. Morel saw through the charade and realized this wasn't trade. No, it was plunder, pure and simple. He blew the whistle on Leopold's operation, revealing that the wealth flowing into Belgium was soaked, drenched, in fact, in the blood of the Congolese people. But Morel said he wasn't alone. Roger Casement, a British diplomat, took it upon himself to travel to the Congo to witness the horrors firsthand. His reports, they were damning. Graphic testimonies, voices trembling with pain, fear, and despair. They say the pen is mightier than the sword, and never was that more true than in this fight for justice. Morel and Casement, along with a growing network of activists and humanitarians, launched what became one of the first international human rights movements. They rallied public opinion. They spoke in packed halls, printing stories that reached every corner of Europe and America. They held up a mirror to the world, forcing it to see not just Leopold's monstrous deeds, but its own complicity in colonial exploitation. The outcry, it grew louder and louder, until it could no longer be ignored. The world demanded answers, and Leopold's carefully crafted facade began to crack. He could no longer hide behind the grand statues of Brussels or the marble halls of his palace. The truth was out there, and it was unstoppable. By 1908, under immense international pressure, King Leopold was forced to relinquish control of the Congo Free State. It was no longer his personal fiefdom, no longer his hidden kingdom of wealth. The Congo was transferred to the Belgian government. But that transfer did little to undo the damage, and by then the land was scarred. But the people broken, their numbers was diminished by the millions. Leopold never faced justice for his crimes. He lived out his days in comfort, surrounded by wealth, untouched by the suffering he had caused. He passed away in 1909, just a year after he lost his grip on the Congo, taking with him the secrets of a fortune built on the backs of countless lives. But here's the thing about history, my friends, it remembers, even when men like Leopold try to bury the truth under layers of lies. History has a way of rising to the surface. Today, the legacy of King Leopold II is being re-examined. Statues of his likeness are being questioned, some even removed, as the world begins to reconcile with the truth of his deeds. In Belgium, the story of Leopold is no longer just that of a king who brought glory to his nation. It is also the story of a tyrant whose cruelty left an indelible mark on the soul of another. And in the Congo, the echoes of Leopold's rule still resonate. The scars of his exploitation can be seen in the economic struggles, the political instability, the lingering wounds of a people who endured unspeakable horrors. Yet, there's also a spirit of resilience, a determination to reclaim the narrative, to turn the pain of the past into a strength that builds the future. The Congo today is a nation striving to rise above its past, a land rich not only in resources, but in culture, strength, and hope. It's a place where the memory of Leopold's atrocities fuels a desire to create a better future, to break free from the chains of a legacy that was never theirs to bear. The people of the Congo are reclaiming their own story, one that speaks not of victimhood, but of resilience, of a spirit that refused to be crushed. So how do we remember King Leopold II today? Was he the builder of a nation or the destroyer of another? Perhaps he was both, or perhaps he was neither. Perhaps, in the end, the true measure of a man's legacy lies not in the monuments he leaves behind, but in the voices he tried to silence. For in those voices, in their strength and their sorrow, lies the real story, a story that cannot be erased, that will not be forgotten, as long as we continue to listen to the echoes of the past. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking the truth, and remember, history is never set in stone. It lives on in the echoes of the past.